Hi. So now we're live because I don't know how to button. So good morning, everybody. We are without Ula today, which means that we are unsupervised.
Hello.
Hello. Anyway, so introductions. My name is Dan Cannahill, the library. I'm a dead language person. I had to write a bio of myself for the Collegio de Iberia's part 2. It was basically like I was going to try and remember what I wrote, but now I can't. So anyway, hi, I'm Kyle, and this is my swapped around camera with my buddy here, who's going to introduce himself.
I'm Bersi Edvardarsson. I can hear myself slightly. And I am. I have a degree in Old Norse, so I'm also a dead language person. Pretty incredible because we seem fairly lively. But here we are. I'm such a dead language person that I'm desperately trying to find one word that I've been looking for all morning, and I still haven't found it for today's thing. That's okay. We'll figure it out.
So today we are talking about Egil Saga, which I have actually not finished the reading for today. So I'm good to go for about half of what we were supposed to talk about. And the rest of it, I will just be pulling out of my head from when I read it in college, which was very recently. Recently, I graduated.
Yeah. I skimmed. So I've read this saga several times, and I've written papers about it, but I skimmed it to reread just the first section. We're going to break this up because it is the second longest saga in our extant saga canon. Although, in terms of things, so here's Egil's Saga, the length in Iceland's Fornrit. So this is in Old Norse. And here, for comparison, is the longest saga, Njal's Saga. So, as you can see, long, but not quite to Njal's Saga size.
Yeah. Well, in Njal's Saga, so I personally... I love Egil Saga. This is a fantastic, and I have read this in the past, so this isn't like the first time I've ever read it. But Njal's Saga is kind of my favorite, only because Njal is such a nerd. He's a consummate warrior and all this kind of stuff, but he's also like, excuse me, the loss. Like, you want a rules lawyer? Like, if you were going to play D&D, right, with all the major saga characters, like let's like, you got Egil at the table, you got Njal at the table, Odin the deep-minded, right? Like, you could have a really fun game, but you would have Njal in the corner just being like, excuse me, the book says.
Yeah.
Like, rules lawyering the shit out of it. It would be very frustrating, but that's why I love him, because he gets me. So
yeah, anyway. He's the prototypical nerd. I mean, he's even like beardless, and like it's kind of shit on for being like, oh, you're not like as manly as the rest. And also you are literally a lawyer and so much a stickler for the rules. And like, what if we didn't do vengeance with violence and instead had some peace? And everyone else is like, no, let's cut each other's heads off now.
So speaking of heads getting cut off, This week we're talking about the part of Egil Saga that doesn't actually have Egil in it. So Egil Saga starts with his grandfather, I think. So we start with Harold the Shaggy, which is a king guy. I'm gonna get this wrong, like right out of the gate. And Harold. Oh, go ahead.
Because we're talking Harold the Shaggy or King Harold Tanglehair, or who will later be known as Fairhair. So this is indeed that big Harold. You may have heard of him. You may have heard of him as being the unifier of Norway. This is definitely a major subject of this book, as well as like Landnámabók, or other ones that have to do with the settlement of Iceland. This is in the settlement period, right at the beginning, where Iceland has definitely been found, and people have already gone and started colonizing the island, but it's a very sparse, and there's lots of open land, and so very as we'll see, there's reasons for leaving in Norway and going out to Iceland.
So Iceland's the traditional date of Iceland's settlement is 842 plus or minus 1, I think. Is like, so there's the settlement museum in Reykjavik, and as you go down the stairs, like they number the stairs, and you get to the bottom, and it's 840, and then it's got like the plus or minus number, which I love, because they're like, yes, we settled it this, and they are big record keepers in Iceland. Like, that is not a thing you screw around. They use Iceland a lot as a source for genetic studies, because they can say, like, everybody knows information. They know who they're related to, like, back all the way to settlement.
And wildly, one of the other things that's really special in terms of genetics studies, one of the weird things, not only do we know who people were related to, but oftentimes we know exactly how they died. And when it comes to like extra information about the person, usually it wasn't just recorded as like so and so, and then married to here, and then like whose children's who, but like also like this person like was blind, and then their son was also blind, inexplicable, you know, and like you can actually trace like genetic like hereditary like diseases and like different things and like traits that got passed along, because like they're just recording that information. So like, thank you, Iceland, for having such a strong book culture.
So anyway, so this the time that this part of the story is taking place is like 820s, 830s. They haven't quite started settling Iceland at this point. The first character we're introduced to is Ulf, who is called Kveldolf, which means night wolf or evening wolf, because he's described, but every day as it drew towards evening, he would grow so ill-tempered that no one would speak to him, and no one could speak to him. And it wasn't long before he would go to bed. There was talk about him being a shape changer, and people called him Kveldolf, which is like this nickname. So his given name is Ulf, very quickly, because personal guess, like bad blood sugar management, right? Like as it goes, after hasn't had anything to eat and he's probably been drinking, his blood sugar tanks and he becomes an asshole. And then
he's just angry all the time.
You know, so he gets this reputation, and he gets this nickname. But he goes on to be a pretty influential figure, despite this asshole behavior. You know, so he's a landholder. He grew to, and he says here, and soon grew to be a figure of great authority. So not a nice guy, but
as long as you're rich and run your farm well, you can be in high standing in this early Scandinavian society.
Yeah.
You don't actually have to have too many, virtues.
Right. You need to be a good friend. So you need to make sure that you're giving gifts and being generous, but your friends don't actually have to like you as a person.
Right.
Which is an interesting thing. So he has these two sons, Thorolf and Grim. Thorolf is handsome and tall and strapping, and he's a good fighter, and he like lots of things. Grim, on the other hand, was dark and ugly, the image of his father in looks and temper, and a very hard worker. So, like, it's nice to know that Iceland bought into this sort of Protestantism very early. Like, what's a good quality? Well, they need to be a hard worker. Like, So that's a herald of things to come much later in Scandinavia.
Indeed, herald. Kveldolf, and his successive sons. Kveldolf is definitely very ugly, and it's really interesting. Like they're very clear about who's ugly and who's beautiful in this, but also that this is all coming out of the same family. So we've got Kveldolf, our night wolf, basically stated to be a berserker, because the concept. So you may be thinking oh, that guy sounds like a werewolf. Yeah, so werewolf sphere, and berserker is like almost a circle. These kind of concepts, the monster that is a werewolf is very similar to kind of what's going on with a berserker, oftentimes involving like a berserker in short is a person who sometimes in battle and then sometimes also just like in normal life can fly into a rage, into a frenzy, and then depending on who you ask and when, the powers of the berserker range from just being like crazy good in battle, just like really, really strong and powerful in battle, all the way up to like up through like you are impervious to steel. You're still just a person, but like cannot be touched by any weaponry. Iron, really, not steel. What am I saying? And then, but all the way up to, for instance, in some legendary sagas, like in Hrolf Saga Kraka, we have characters like what's his face? Bodvar Bjarki, who can fully become like he astral projects a giant bear. And like, so like some of them are like truly shapeshifters who become animals, either bears or wolves, very strong, fierce creatures. And so when they call him Night Wolf and say that he gets really angry and all these things, and then later on they have some like very specific descriptions. Where did I put it in my notes? Page 46. It is said that people who could take on the character of animals or went berserk became so strong in this state that no one was a match for them, but also that just after it wore off, they were left weaker than usual. Kveldulf was the same, so that when his frenzy wore off, he felt exhausted by the effort he had made and was rendered completely powerless and had to lie down and rest. This is, by the way, right before he dies.
Like, though, who among us, having gone into a bit of a frenzy, doesn't need a bit of a nap after, right? Like, that seems totally fair. You sometimes you have a little nutty, and then, you know, maybe you yell at the neighbor's kids or something, and then later you're just like, look, guys, that was a lot. That was a lot of emotional energy, and nappy time.
Time for me to take a little lie down. This sort of idea of there needing to be like a refractory period actually has been used to sort of give supporting evidence. One of my favorite theories about Beowulf is Grendel as a berserker. And sort of like Grendel's monstrosity is because of his nature as a berserker, and how and he's ostracized from the community in a similar way that many berserkers are in other sources, either because they like end up harming like their own children or like community members just because they've flown into a rage at the wrong time. Like a berserker is exactly who you want to be on your side in battle, but maybe not the best next door neighbor.
Yeah, if we think back to Hervor Saga, the Hervor at one point faces this group of berserkers, and it's like, and then there was the berserkers that nobody liked, and it's used as a very derogatory like feeling, right? Like,
and that even you even see that happen in when Skallagrim, we'll get to this, but when Skallagrim brings his group of berserkers, and basically he's also one. Basically, what I'm kind of getting at is Kveldulf has his descendants, and at each tier in each generation, there is one berserker and one Thorolf. Literally gonna be named Thorolf. The guy is Thorolf in both Grimm's. So Skallagrim means bald Grimm. Skallagrim's brother's name is Thorolf. And then the next line down, he has two sons, Egil and Thorolf. And Thorolf is always the pretty boy who's strong and good and like just like the absolute paragon, and always dies. So it's a very funny little like the good die young, but the ugly bad berserkers, they're gonna outlive everybody.
They're hardy. They're a hardy folk.
Very hardy. But just to wrap up the whole Grendel thing, like if you are shapeshifting into a monster and you're already ostracized from your society, right? You come in and you're coming in just to like, mess around and kill a whole bunch of people who, snubbed you before. And then that leads to like that fits in with the whole you're impervious to iron, right? Grendel could not be touched by any of the iron weaponry, but Beowulf is able to rip his arm off with his bare hands. And then after the battle, I mean, for one thing, your arm is off, so like you're gonna need to rest. But then Grendel goes back, and when Beowulf finds him again, if I remember correctly, he's asleep. He's out
sleeping off that arm.
And cannot, and so if you think of him as a berserker, and this is that refractory period. So that's one of my favorite, like, ooh, what if Grendel's not really a monster, but just like a dude?
Yeah, no, I like that. I hadn't read that theory, but I like it, and I feel like it makes sense. And it's also all this talk of berserkers, kind of something I'd never really thought of before, is that there is shades of the Hercules myth in the berserker stuff, right? Like Hercules famously, kills his family in a rage. He is, I mean, he's a demigod, right? So that's the explanation for why he's not unkillable, but he's largely basically impervious to harm, and he's super strong, and he does go into these rages, but then he has to go through like, oops, I fucked up the 12 labors, right? And I don't know that, I'm not arguing that there's a connection between the two, but it is interesting to me that you see sort of shades of similarity where like you have this great warrior who is incredibly useful when he's on your side, but there's a cost to it. And the cost is that he's not, it's a cannon, and you really want to aim it up, towards the enemy, front towards enemy, right? But every so often that cannon explodes on you and causes damage, right? Yeah. So anyway, that's
what being close to Egil's family is like.
Yeah.
As evidenced by everything that happens in Egil's saga. But to just sort of briefly summarize the chunk of story that happens before Egil is born, because we're going to tackle all of like Egil's bit later. The whole first section is setting up a really important political struggle between Egil's family and King Harold, this case, beginning as Tanglehair. Famously, he's like, I'm not going to comb or cut my hair until I have unified Norway. So he was Tanglehair for a really long time, and then he became Fairhair when he finally got to comb it out and be so beautiful and luxurious. Also, when we say unifying Norway, do not think of the current boundaries of where Norway is. Norway here is probably just the southern section of what is now Norway and the northern section of what is now Denmark, and a little bit of Sweden, if I remember correctly. But it's not. It's not what we think of as Norway now.
The historical boundaries of the Scandinavian countries get really tricky. So first off, you've got the the Sami up north, right? So the Sami territory is largely remains just the Sami up there. Trondheim is the farthest north real major settlement in Norway, and it is pretty far north. But nobody from southern Scandinavia looks at northern Scandinavia and is like, that's where I want to go, because it's a hard life, right? Like living in the subarctic as I do, right? I don't look at like Fairbanks, which I love visiting, but I'm not like, yes, I'm going to move up there because life will be better. Like, right. I'm already short on daylight down here. Like, I don't need to remove more daylight from my life and have it colder, right? Like, it would be lovely to see my friends more frequently, but I need my friend the sun, and it's lovely vitamin D.
Yes, and crops also agree usually.
Right. But Denmark, so historically the Kingdom of Denmark contains a chunk of what we now consider Sweden. Right. Sweden is the bit above the forest. So there's this big sort of forest that cuts modern day Sweden in chunks, and Denmark has the bit below the forest. Sweden has the bit above the forest.
Usually around Uppsala, if you want to have modern cities in your head.
And then
Yeah.
Norway's got its own thing. And Greta, so sorry, I knew if I mentioned Fairbanks, I was going to regret it. I don't regret it, but Greta, I love you, and I do love visiting Fairbanks. But the sun and
but the sun.
Oh, I love you, and I've lived in Anchorage my whole life, so there's some like built-in feelings about that. So anyway, let's move on in the story.
Yes. So basically, what happens is not getting like too deep into like what's going on with the political struggles, but like essentially we've got some relatives of Thorolf. So we've got the first Thorolf here, brother of Grim or Skallagrim, bald Grim, right? So he's very pretty, whereas Skallagrim is like very super tall, like so tall, stands out amongst a crowd of very tall people, and super bald, which is considered very ugly also. Like this is part of his grossness, is he's bald. So sorry for everyone who's bald. I
feel like sorry, I'm going to interrupt. So my dad in his youth was 6'8". As he has gotten older, he's gotten shorter, and he went bald relatively young. So I'm now thinking that making him stand under the Njal sign was wrong, and that we did visit. So next episode, when we talk about Skallagrim's fate, I do have a picture because we did see Skallagrim's reported burial mound.
Right.
Like it's in this little city park. Like you're in this little town in Iceland, and in the city park, there's like this burial mound that says Skallagrim on top, and they're very like, this is Skallagrim's burial ground. Maybe.
Sure. Hey, you know what? I've seen so many pictures of Christian relics. You've got a burial mound. Essentially, Kveldulf has a fairly large and successful farm, and is sort of a staple of like his area and his community, and is in charge of, he and Skallagrim are in charge of collecting taxes for this area, for King Harald, or rather Thorolf becomes the one who is doing this, collecting the taxes, and he's collecting and he's paying tribute as well, and it's always quite large. Yes.
Yeah. So before all that, we have to set up Harald as King of Norway. So Harald doesn't start the story as King of Norway.
Right.
So Harald starts the story as the king of his little bit of Norway. And we have this other guy, Arnvid, who is the king of the bit that that Skallagrim and Kveldulf and them all live in.
Right. They're not under King Harald at first.
Right.
And they don't really take too kindly to the unification.
Right. And nobody does. They're all like, they're not fans. But so Harald goes off on this, like, I'm going to unify Norway. Arnvid sends his messengers to Kveldulf and is like, hey, big man of my area, you're going to fight for me, right? And Kveldulf is like, you know what? I think I'm going to stay out of this one. Mm-hmm. And there's this great line. So the last few episodes we did, we're talking about luck. And so one of the things I was kind of watching for as we went through this story was mentions of luck, and especially King's luck. And something I thought was interesting was when he gets called to fight for Arnvid, Kveldulf is like, I'm not gathering any forces and setting off at any campaigns against Shaggy Harald. The way I see it, Harald has all the luck he'll ever need. And while our king hasn't even a fistful. So our king has no luck. Helping him will not get me any luck. Like I won't benefit by this. Whereby Harald seems to be doing great. I'm also, though, because I'm, not sworn to Harald, and I don't, spoiler alert, don't really ever plan to be. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to help him out. I'm not going to help him against Arnvild. I'm just going to let it play out, see what happens. Right. And so what happens, of course, is that
he was right. Harold had all the luck.
Yeah. So, and something else. So the next chapter, they're talking about Harold's victory. The title is Victory for Harold. So spoilers. But one of the things I thought was interesting in that chapter was one of the characters, the sons of Atli. And Atli is the Norse form of the name Attila the Hun. And I don't think here what they're talking about is the sons of Attila. In the legendary sagas, like in the Volsung saga, Atli shows up, and that is believed to be a direct reference to Attila the Hun, like as this memory of this fight between the Goths and the Huns. Right. Here, it's just the name that has survived, likely because of those stories, as just a name for people in Scandinavia. So anyway, that to me, that's just like an interesting onomastics moment where you're like, Atli, wait a second, Attila the Hun showing up here? He's not, but like I love it.
Yeah. That's a few hundred years too late for
right. So Harold eventually takes control. Yeah. And once he gained full control of the provinces, Harold kept a sharp eye on the landed men and rich farmers and anyone he might expect trouble from. So cool. And this was a part that I thought was really interesting. So I want in your head while I read this, I want you to hold the image of Eddie Izzard doing his cake or death skit, right? Like just hold cake or death in your head. He gave them a choice of three things. They could swear loyalty to him, or they could leave the country. But if they chose the third, they could resign themselves to the most savage terms, perhaps even death. There were cases where Harold had people's arms and legs hacked off. In every province, Harold took over both farming land and estates, blah, blah, blah. So you have three choices. You can leave, you can swear to loyalty, or you can be hacked to death. And I'm really like, there's part of me that's going, why were these the three choices? Like, swear loyalty or leave seemed like a great, or you can die.
Or you can die.
Unpleasantly die, not just like your head gets chopped off, but we're going to cut your arms and legs off, and then presumably that's all we need to do, really. Right. You on your way.
Something tells me sepsis at least is not going to be great.
So then we move on from that, and we start to see really the authors. So we've talked in the past about interrogating sources and like watching for the author's biases. Many a man went on the run from this tyranny, and many a wilderness became inhabited, both east in Yamatland and in Hälsingeland, and west in the Hebrides, as well as parts around Dublin and Ireland, Normandy in France, Caithness in Scotland, Orkney, Shetland, and the Faroes, and that's when Iceland was discovered. So tyranny is the bit as you're reading this, you're like, okay, I see where you're going, author. The tyranny of Norway is why we all moved to Ireland. Like, Ireland's lovely.
I do love that this is sort of being like, it's odd that we're out in so many different places, huh? We must have all been pushed out by Harold Fairhair. That was definitely what was going on. And so, like, definitely the main. It's interesting, actually. I hadn't even realized that they explain, because it's a common thing for people to be like, everyone moved to Iceland because Harold Fairhair was being a tyrant. And they use that word so many times in this saga. He's the tyranny of Harold. He's such a tyrant. We hate this guy. But I hadn't realized that they were attributing like all of the sort of migratory patterns and like raiding, and then when they would go on raids and then be like, actually, hey, wait, Ireland's got some pretty nice green pastures. What if I set up here? And like just looking at like, oh, there's some great runestones, they're gravestones that are shapes of crosses on the Isle of Man that are written with both Manx and like Old Norse names in like the same family, like a husband and a wife, and then like their children have like mixed Manx and Old Norse names and stuff. It's just like people are just settling in places all over because basically Scandinavia sucks for farming. But I love that I hadn't realized that they were attributing all of that to Harold Fairhair being a dick.
Which it is. So one of the things that that amuses me now that you're talking about, especially farming, right? Like, and it is before the discovery of the potato, farming in the north is a rough experience. Like Alaska, we have some great farming. We've got cabbage grows enough to like make coleslaw for an army, like a big fucking cabbage. We get giant pumpkins, potatoes, root vegetables. Like if you want a good root vegetable, we got that under control. But in terms of like oranges Or when I go down to California, when I went to California in the before times, like wandering around the grocery store, it's just like your melon comes in multiple colors. You have orange and green. They're not all just beige. Like you laugh, but growing up in Alaska, it was like, it's melon. And nobody ever clarified was it honeydew or the other one I can't even remember the name of, because it was all just
watermelon?
Sort of, no, you have
honeydew or
the other one. And I don't know which is
I don't eat melons very much.
That's okay. The point is, though, that we didn't know the difference because they were all just
cantaloupe.
Sort of the same. Cantaloupe, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we do have mega rhubarb. So some stuff, if it can handle a short growing season, it does pretty well here. But that's not the point. Before all of that, growing things in the Arctic and subarctic areas was a rough experience, right? Like there's a reason that farming was never part of the indigenous cultures of northern Alaska, right?
And
it just wasn't really.
And there's a reason why Scandinavians have fish and dairy as such large staples of their diets, because you can't grow crops. You've got to get your food from somewhere, and cheese, butter, processed milk, like preserved milk products, dairy things can keep you going. And then, of course, there's the meat from those dairy animals and stuff like that. So
the point of all this, before I totally got sidetracked, was that some of the places that they describe them going to are really what I consider like primo farming territories. Iceland, the Faroes, Caithness,
Orkneys.
Orkney. Like these aren't really what I look at when I look at pictures, because I've never gotten to go to the Orkneys. I am going to go someday. I'm also going to go to the Faroes. I almost went to the Faroes when we went to Iceland.
With you.
Yes, absolutely. No,
like, I fit in most luggage. I'm
like
pretty small.
Saga Saturday does the Viking Trail through. Like I am on board for this trip.
We'll take a GoPro and make sure to record stuff for Saga Saturday.
We should start a Patreon. Send us to
the Faroes. It's just us screaming in excitement. You can't understand anything we're saying. Anyway.
So was there a warming period? I think this was the beginning of a warming period, but that does still, yes. The problem with especially with the islands is that the soil just isn't there. So warm or not, it's like Iceland has great soil because it's volcanic. The problem is even in a warming period, Iceland is not really going to be in a good position for farming. And it was also during settlement. It's not now, but during the settlement period, it was a pretty forested island.
But now those are gone.
Yeah, they were gone pretty quick. But yeah, the Orkneys, the Faroes, Cape, these areas, not great farming areas. England, good farming. Ireland, good farming. Normandy, you want a cider tree. Normandy is the place to get cider. It's phenomenal. But yeah, so Virginia, you're correct. I think we are moving into a warming period, but it wouldn't help on the islands.
Yeah. But so everyone's leaving Norway because of Harold. And essentially, what ends up happening is Kveldulf and family are camping out to sort of see what's going to happen. And Thorolf, this poster child, is like, hey, I mean, I need to make a name for myself like any young, early medieval Scandinavian man. I gotta go and prove my worth. And so, long story short, he goes and becomes part of the king's, he goes into the service of King Harold.
It's against his father's recommendation.
Right.
His father says, I see no luck for this family with King Harold, at all. And Thorolf is just like, you're a shrewd man, full of ambition, but no gratitude for the king.
Right. Like, where else am I going to get my renown unless I go with the king, right? And so he goes, and the thing is, the king was advised to put him in, the king's already, not really vibing with Kveldulf and family. But the king is advised to take Thorolf on into his service, specifically so that he can keep closer tabs on him, keep your friends closer and your enemies closer. And Thorolf just gets slandered over and over and over again whenever he's out and about doing things. And the king keeps listening to this slander. And so even when Thorolf's coming back with like huge tributes, better than anyone's ever seen, that the king eventually is like comes around to, and this guy Olvir, who's such a stand-up guy, who's in the service of the king and keeps trying to be like, dude, these guys are just trying to be normal to you, but you're like always seeing like the worst in whatever they're doing. He's like, no, please, Harold, come out and like see the tribute. And he sees it and he gets a little happier by the end. But eventually the slander and lies that are being told about Thorolf and Thorolf's ambitions to like, take over and all these other things, get the better of King Harold, and he ends up killing Thorolf. And pretty sleazily too. He starts off with, when they go to raid the place where Thorolf and his men are, King Harold says like, we're not gonna, if they come out of their hall to fight us, we'll lose. So let's burn the hall down. And so Thorolf and his men have to like escape the hall by like using one of the support beams as a battering ram. They break through the wall, and they were doing pretty well, standing in the entryway, trying to fight their way out, until the fire sort of came from behind and killed a bunch of the guys who were still inside. And then finally Thorolf manages to break out, and he's described as slashing left and right, hacking his way through the king's men, and he gets all the way up to where the king is. And I marked down this page because I thought it was so cool. He says, battle ensued then, and for a while the farm shielded Thorolf and his men from behind, but when it started to burn, the fire closed in on them, and many of them were killed. Thorolf ran forward, hewing to both sides towards the king's standard. Then Thorgil's boomer was killed. When Thorolf reached the wall of shields around the king, he thrust his sword through the standard bearer. Thorolf said, I took 3 steps too few here.
We're back to that primo, like, dry wit.
Yeah.
Kind of.
He makes it all the way up to the shield line, protecting the king, kills the standard bearer, the flag bearer for the king, and then says, I should have taken 3 more steps, because then he would have gotten the king, but he was attacked with both swords and spears, and the king himself delivered the mortal blow, and Thorolf fell at his feet. Notably, as stated by Kveldulf when he hears this news later, the fact that he fell face down at the king's feet means that vengeance will be had, according to superstition that Kveldulf relays to us. But essentially, this begins the cycle of course, needing compensation for somebody's death. That's really sets off the rivalry between these two families. Like all good Icelandic family sagas, this is a family feud saga. And so sort of it gets very close in at the end here. And so basically Skallagrim goes to ask Harold for compensation, and he brings with him notably 12 very strong. He basically gets like it's essentially as if like he showed up at the seediest biker bar possible and picked out.
Oh no, he froze. Oh no, did I freeze? Who froze? Can somebody shoot?
Am I back?
You're back. There we go.
So he gets the meanest dudes, and they go and they show up. So of course the king, Olvir is once again trying to broker this and trying to keep the peace and make everything right. And Olvir's the one who was like, hey, King Harold, please just give them compensation. Like, I think this is the right thing to do. And the king's like, sure, yeah, fine, I'll do it. But when these guys show up, and Skallagrim says like he's not eloquent at all, which I think is really funny, especially since, and I think we'll talk about poetry more in the next one, but there's only a couple of poems in this first section. But Skallagrim actually says at least one verse that I found, and Kveldulf says at least 3 different verses, although Kveldulf's verses are much more interesting and complex, in my opinion, than Skallagrim's. But Skallagrim's like, I don't know how to talk good. And Olvir's like, I'll say everything. And Olvir does this beautiful, like, of course you should give compensation and blah, 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 blah. And the king ignores him, points at Skallagrim because he's this super tall, bald guy. And he's literally stands above the rest of these huge viper guys. It's sort of like I saw recently someone posted a picture of, from the set of Conan the Barbarian, of Andre the Giant and Wilt Chamberlain standing next to Arnold Schwarzenegger. So imagine you've got like a group of Arnold Schwarzeneggers, and then there's just like one Andre the Giant standing there, but who's bald. And he's like, that guy's Skallagrim, huh? And Olvir's like, yes, you recognized him.
Well, sir.
And he says, be in my service. He's basically doing the exact same thing again, right? Like, hey, my gift, my compensation is the honor of being in my service. And Skallagrim's like, no. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to follow what my father said. And he tries really hard. He does actually a pretty good job of being like, I have to refuse because like, I can't possibly be as good as my brother Thorolf was. Like, I know you're trying to replace Thorolf, but like, I ain't that guy. I can't do that for you. But he is refusing a gift from the king. And so this is pretty bad. And so he and his group, they leave. They get on their boat and they hightail it out of there. And luckily, Olvir is still a pretty stand-up guy. And Olvir and a couple of his men actually hack away at all of the ships, all of the king's ships that are still there. And just like in The Sound of Music, when the nuns take all the car parts out of the Nazis' cars, they get to the ships and they're like, there's no seaworthy vessels here. We can't follow them. So they get away, and long story short, this tension means that Kveldulf and the whole lot are like, we gotta flee the country. Like, the king is gonna come for us. Kveldulf does manage, he goes berserk one more time to steal a ship from some guys. It was Thorolf's old ship. And this is the part that I was trying to find a word from, because as far as I am aware, the lovely double-headed axe is something that is just a fantasy genre item. Like, they're real medieval Scandinavians were not using double-headed axes. Except in this translation, Kveldulf uses a double-headed axe, like very specifically a double-headed axe, to do this particular lovely killing where he chops a guy's head. He's in his berserk mode, and he chops a guy so hard through the head that it goes through his helmet and all the way down. Like, it chops his head in half. Although, and it's described as getting down to the blade was so far in that it was up to the handle of the axe. So the entire one head of the axe is in his head. And then when he pulls it out, it actually flings the man up and over his head and then overboard behind him, like off the side of the ship. And this is like weeks before Kveldulf, who's like in his late 60s or something. Like, he's an old man already at this point, especially for the time period. He's like already like past his prime, and he just does this no problem, and he dies like a little while later because he gets sick. But they describe it as he has a gigantic double-bladed axe in his hand. And
so this translation describes it as a halberd. So here it says Kveldolf was carrying a halberd. So I am very curious what the Old Norse is. So
the Old Norse, I found it finally, and it's the sentence which here is translated as Kveldolf had a gigantic double-bladed axe in his hand. Is Kveldolfur hafti I hendi, so exactly what it says. Kveldolf hafti I hendi in his hand. Bryntroll, just Bryntro, hook O, so, or if you want to spell it with modern orthography, that'll be O with an umlaut, LL. Bryntroll. And Bryn is usually used as like bright, and it's I've seen it with other weapons. But I'm trying to, and there's there appears to be a footnote. Unfortunately, the footnote is in Icelandic.
So doing some quick, while you're looking at that, doing some quick Googling, I have learned something about Bryntroll. It is a weapon in WoW called Bryntroll the Bone Arbiter, which is an excellent name. And I'm going to see if I can share a picture of it because it's completely worth the visual. Let's see, application window.
I just went to translate, like on Google, I just clicked in translate, right? And they automatically have Icelandic as the thing that I'm going to be translating from. And I'm just like, oh, Google, you have my data, huh?
So anyway, this is in WoW. That's the axe. So now we all know.
That's what Kveldolf used. I'm looking up this particular Icelandic word because it says Bryntroll were something. Something in Icelandic. And I'm sure it's the word I'm looking for. Fine.
While he's looking that up, I just want to say, I'm going to get your name wrong. I'm sorry. Telizin? Yes. I think this is something we should. This is an ANS entry waiting to happen. Egil Saga as culture sound of music clips.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I actually this is very similar to one of the papers that I wrote about Egil Saga, was how to make Egil Saga into a video game. Hey, game designers, if anyone wants some ideas, I've already thought it all out. I don't know how to make games or code. So, but if you hit me up.
So I don't know if people are familiar with the YouTube channel Star Kid, but they do musicals, right? So they did the Harry Potter musical, and then there's another one that I find deeply funny called Firebringer, which is all about the arrival of fire to humanity. It does not get
famous. I don't really want to do the work.
I don't really want to do the work today. I don't want. But anyway, this is me telling them that they should do an Egil Saga musical because I would watch the shit out of that, and it would also be hilarious.
It looks like okay. So what I was thinking is getting closer, according to the footnote that's in Icelandic that I'm reading, that I can only understand like half of, because I'm reading Icelandic through Old Norse. But they're basically saying in this footnote, in Iceland's Fornrit, that Bryntroll is basically, it's meaning it's a blinding weapon. It's a blindingly bright weapon. So what I was thinking with Bryn meaning bright seems to be what's going on here. So really unsure where the Penguin, whoever translated this particular saga in the Penguin Classics version, this version of Egil Saga, I'm not sure where they got double-bladed axe from, because it doesn't say that. It simply does not say that in Old Norse. So this has been a mystery that I've been thinking about for a very long time, and I'm glad that we have live on Saga Saturday satisfied that itch.
So I want to go back in the story a bit really quick, or not really quick, that's going to be a little bit, but and talk about sort of the origin of the feud. because it's not just that Harold gets mad at Thorolf for no reason, right? Like it's not that this anger, like he is not cast well in the story. Harold is not, like, he is given to moods constantly. He's just like, if he feels slighted at
angry
all,
at the drop of a hat, and he's
right, like
really not good at
regulating,
pretending like he's fine. Like everyone around always knows exactly how Harold is feeling.
So I want to talk about the origins of this and how he gets sort of built up. But I first want to mention very briefly, Ulfir is this character who shows up in Harold's court. And he's a regulating influence. He's like, hey, king, it's cool, be chill. And I just want to briefly touch on how he is introduced to us in this saga. So he is introduced just in this very short chapter. He arrives at a feast. He in the autumn, a great number of people came to Gaular for a sacrificial feast there. That was when Ulfir Hnufa first saw Solveig and fell in love with her. Later, he asked for her hand in marriage, but the Earl, Solveig's father, thought Ulfir wasn't good enough and refused him. Many were the love songs that Ulfir composed for Solveig. And then he goes off in his life and goes off and does stuff. And I don't think we ever meet Solveig again. But it's so sweet. Like you meet, like this whole time, there's a part of me that's like kind of loves Ulfir just because, one, he's like, hey, king, be chill, my guy. But also because, like, clearly he falls in love with this woman whose name, by the way, is the name that I used at Danish camp. So I was Solveig. I know, it's very sweet. So anyway, Ulfir falls in love with Solveig. Solveig's dad's like, or not. And then Ulfir like sits in his corner and writes love poetry, which you are not, by the way, supposed to do. Like, that's writing love poetry about a woman is kind of considered pretty not appropriate, because you don't want to cast spells on her and make her fall in love with you, right? Like, it gets a little, love poetry gets pretty tricky pretty quickly. But going back to where this feud sort of arises from is we have to introduce a character named Bard. So Bard and Thorolf become bestest friends. And Bard takes Thorolf when he goes to get married, and he's like, this is my best man. This is my very best friend in the whole world. Bard is the son of Björnulf, who is the son of Bjorgulf, which, thank God, they gave Bard his own name, because if I had to keep track of another Bjorgulf, I was going to lose my goddamn mind. So
the names of the berserkers that Skallagrim takes are also like all grim. It's like grim this, grim that, and and they're not even related to him.
I hate it. Thanks, I hate it. So Bjorgulf has Brynolf by his first wife, who never gets a name in this story. But then Bjorgulf, so she presumably dies or just goes into the great hereafter. I'm not entirely sure what happens. But Bjorgulf, she does die. He is at this drinking party one day, and they cast lots to determine who gets to drink with who. So the theory here is that you would cast these lots to avoid men fighting over women. So you were paired off by like male female groups, and you or pairs, and you were assigned a beautiful young woman to drink, or a woman to drink with, who was single. So you're single, she's single, and there's never really like an expressed, like, she's expected to provide you with sexual favors, but she is sort of expected to entertain you for the evening. So sex ? But definitely, like, she's supposed to pay attention to you and like make you feel a little bit less like you're stuck at a sausage fest drinking party. So he's sat down with this, by lots, assigned this woman named Hildred, who is very beautiful. And they have plenty to talk about all evening, and he thought her a fine looking girl. And a little later, the feast comes to an end. He comes back to to her family later. Her father, Hogni, has ale vats brought out into the hall, and Hildred begins serving the ale to the guests. Bjorgulf called Hogni over to join him and said, I'll tell you what brings me here. I'm taking your daughter back home with me and mean to tie a loose marriage knot here and now. So they're not going through the formal wedding ceremony at this point, but he's like, this is bride abduction. So I'm taking this girl home with me, and I'm telling you formally that I'm single. I don't have a second wife at home. So like, this is an understanding. I'm expressing to you an understanding that this is going to be a marriage. which is important because that marriage would secure inheritance rights for any children that they have.
Yes.
Which they do. They have two sons, Herrick and Hrerick, because
yes.
fuck you. So Herrick and Hrerick are called the Hildredar sons.
Hildred's sons, or as I saw here, what was it? It was I can do genitive. Hildredar Sinner. Yeah, so it's the same AR thing that's going on with my name, Edvard. So it would be Edvardr, and then Edvardar makes it possessive. So it's Hildredar Sinner, all one word.
Yeah,
that's the sons of Hildred.
So they have these children, and then Bjorgulf kicks the bucket because he's old and he's just dies. The problem is Brynolf doesn't particularly like Hildred and her sons, and so he kicks Hildred. She tells the three of them to clear out. Take your sons and clear out. And immediately, like his father's body has just gone to the grave, and the new wife and their kids are kicked out. And he does not give those two sons an inheritance. So he then, which is very naughty, right? Like if we understand that statement by his father to this woman who he's now kidnapping and taking home, and Greta, yes, Norse naming conventions, Herrick and Hrerick. Why? So Brynolf, by rights, by that statement that Bjorgulf had made to Hildred's father, there should be inheritance for the sons, because that sounds like there was at least an informal marriage contract made.
And honestly, they should have protection and like be taken care of, especially if like the sons aren't of age yet. Like if it's even shown later in the saga when the king is put in, like one of the king's men dies and sends word to the king, like, could you take care of my farm and also children? And the king's like, I'll take your sons, to bring your son, the sons will come to me, and then I'll put someone in charge of raising your daughters so that eventually I'll marry them off when they're of age, and then it'll be fine. So like that's a very common thing to have happen if the husband/father like dies, like someone else steps in and sort of fosters the rest. But so to be kicked out and like show no hospitality in that way is a pretty big deal.
And it seems that the sons are pretty young, because the sons are roughly of a generation with Brynolf's son.
Right.
So Brynolf marries Helga, who is the daughter of Kettle Trout, and through Kettle Trout is related to Kveldulf and Thorolf. So they're like second or third cousins. There might be a removal in there, but they're related. So Bard and Thorolf, who go on to be best buddies, are sort of distantly related to each other. And so just keep the Herricks in mind over there. They're over here, right? And they're refused by Brynjolf. Brynjolf. They're refused inheritance there. When Brynjolf dies and Bard comes into the inheritance, they are again refused inheritance, which is, things are getting kind of shady, right? So then when Bard dies, which Bard eventually, like, he dies in this great battle, but not before he can say to the king, so he's mortally wounded and he's in front of the king and he's like, hey, king, I don't have a will written out because we don't do that here, but I am telling you that I wish to leave my lands, everything I possess, and my wife to my best buddy Thorolf. And the king's like, yeah, that seems reasonable. That's definitely how we treat women as part of chattel property. Totally cool. And so Thorolf inherits everything from Bard. Sigurd is not necessarily thrilled with the concept, but she also, I'm trying to find where they talk about it. She acknowledges, like, it's the death of her husband is a great blow to Sigurd. All the same, Thorolf was no stranger to her. He'd been at their wedding. He's been around, like, he's her husband's best friend. and she knew well enough what a great man he was and how good a husband he would be. And since this was what the king wanted, she and her friends agreed that given the approval of her father, it would be a good thing for her to marry Thorolf. So Thorolf took charge of everything, including the king's stewardship. So,
good enough match, and seems like an upstanding guy, and I already know him.
Right.
Sure.
It could be a lot worse. So, but this does sort of raise a really... Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to say it is important, like that, like they mention what she says and what she thinks, because she is a widow now, and she does have actual final say over her own marriage in this case. So like it's she still does the very typical thing of like, I'm still going to defer to what the king says, and also if my father agrees. But like they are asking her first, because as a widower, she has she no longer is only the first time you get married do you like have no say as a woman at all whatsoever of what happens to you. So it's interesting that they're like, what do you think? And she's like, whatever they think.
Yeah, so this was something where I had this brief moment where we have in popular culture this notion of sort of the freedom and the power of Viking age, of Norse women, as like all this kind of, like I'm using the word like a lot, and somewhere my 12th grade English teacher is making seal noises at me. So just that's in my head right now. Anyway, in popular culture, in sort of the popular imagination, we have this image of Viking age women as free under the law. They have all these rights,
shield maidens and Valkyrie.
Right. That especially important here is that women in other parts of Europe at the same time didn't have, which in some regards, absolutely they do. But this is a great example of technically, yes, it's her option, but she's not in a position where she could be like, you know what, screw you, buddy. I don't want to get married to you. I fell in love with a stable hand and it's going to be gorgeous and we're going to live together forever.
Yeah.
Like
that's going to ruin your life.
Right.
It's whether or not, and this is an interesting thing to just like, that's this kind of tension is still true today. It's true whenever, right? Like if like something may be technically allowed and legal, but like for instance, if we just talk about like same subject, divorce rates in the United States only, right? Like first off, until it was legal for women to pursue a divorce rates were very low. And until certain social programs were put in place, like domestic violence shelters and different funding for various like programs to help women and their families get out of situations. If you have no social safety net, if you have no support, how are you going to be able to leave that marriage? Right. So like that is the same kind of thing, right? Like she may technically by law have the choice to deny this marriage, but there's no way socially she actually has a choice to deny this marriage, right? Like the king has been is telling her, you're marrying this guy. And she's like, well, if my father says so, if like not the king, but like if you say so, and also my father says yes, then I'm good to go. And this is like very common. Most women at the time would not be like asserting their will in these circumstances, because socially the structure is such that like that would be ruinous. You ruin your life if you did that.
So we've got so now Bard's dead. Thorolf's married. Bard's widow taken on taken on Bard's possessions and Bard's debts, which are to these two, the Hildred's sons. We're just going to
Hildred's sons, yes.
Yeah, Hildred's sons. So the two sons, Herrick and Frerick, fuck you. Herrick and Frerick show up and they're like, hey, like, we were owed an inheritance from our father's estate, then by our half brother. And now you are the inheritor of our half-brother's estate, and we still haven't gotten an inheritance. So WTF, yo. And Thorolf is like, hey, I don't see that you have any right to the inheritance, Thorolf said angrily. The way that I heard it, your mother was taken by force and carried off like a captive. And with that, their conversation came to an end. So Thorolf, like we shouldn't blame, I think, too much. We shouldn't blame Thorolf too much, because this, he doesn't have the book that he can flip back a few chapters and be like, oh wait, there was a loose marriage contract that gets tricky with the carried off by force thing. He's just working on what he was told, and what he was told by people he trusted, right? We've talked in the past about how trust was a major element of social currency, and the Havamal tells us, right? The only thing you have is your name, right? And so you have to maintain a good name, and you have to maintain, the power of your good name, because without your good name, you got no currency, buddy. And so here we have a great
example connected to that. If are you passing on good information?
Right. So this is exactly what's happening here. Is Herrick and Hrerik, while they are probably actually due an inheritance, I don't know that it ever clarifies if they went through all the marriage rites, though presumably they didn't, because people would remember and put that onus on Brynolf to be like, hey, your father really did marry this woman, you owe these kids. So that's
it seems like things weren't
totally above board.
And all this complication is exactly what you're saying.
So now that Thorolf has denied the Hildred sons, they're like, fuck this noise. So they go to the court of heralds, where Thorolf has already established himself at the court. They arrive at the court. They're decent enough people. They establish a name there as well. And they're the ones who start whispering in Harold's ear, saying, Thorolf's not the guy you think he is. He's not all that special. And so they're the ones who start this sort of slander campaign. And it starts in chapter 12, and they really just start laying down like Harold visits Thorolf before chapter 12 and is a little bit insulted because Thorolf invites everybody he can think of. And the king feels like, you're trying to put me to shame by showing how generous you are by inviting all these people to a feast. But then Thorolf gives him a fine ship, the very best ship, right? And then points out...
This is the same ship that they steal back later, by the way.
Excellent.
With Veldulf's not double-headed axe.
But they do kind of, he eventually sort of explains to the king, like, I invited all these people because I wanted to do you honor. I wanted to show how well loved you are in my county. These people all came to see you. This is all in your name. He gives them the ship, and suddenly the king's mood improves. He has been, by the way, literally the moodiest.
Every interaction with Thorolf goes this way, pretty much, where the king's like, you're the worst, and I'm gonna take everything that you're doing, which is nice, in the worst possible way. And then Thorolf's like, literally, I'm just trying to be nice to you. And the king's like, oh, I love gifts.
Yeah, thanks for this ship. Which, when you think about what a ship like that would be valued at, it would be an incredibly rich gift. Right, like that's like the king arrives and you give him a BMW not even a BMW, like that's
the king arrives and you give him a Learjet.
Right, there you go.
You just give him a Learjet. You're like, here, have a private jet.
Yeah, it's present for you. It's just sitting on the tarmac. Here's the keys, or whatever you use to start a plane. I don't know. Do they have keys?
Do they have keys?
Write in. Tell us the answer. So anyway, this is when Herrick and Hrerik start whispering in the king's ear, and like they start slandering Thorolf, and Ulfir is trying to sort of backtrack their work, but they're just there. And Harold is not a man given to, he wants to be mad. He just wants to be mad. So that brings us eventually forward to Harold getting big mad, as the youth say, and killing Thorolf. And it's so interesting to me that the fight that will carry this entire saga, the family fight between the descendants of the descendants of Kveldulf and Harold and his family. Like Egil at one point is going to raise a kneading pole and be like to Harold and his wife, like full on fighting, right? Is all down to the fact that people he's not even related to, got slighted by their family, and then eventually his uncle marries their half-brother's wife and refuses. I think that's right. I keep having to flip back to the.
It's complicated.
So Egil's uncle Thorolf marries the widow of the half. No,
wait.
Marries the widow of the son of the half brothers who were slighted.
Here's the. Yeah, I'm looking for the big old.
Yeah.
It's. Oh no, and this is the one that's actually. This one's not even just Egil's saga. This is all of the different sagas that are in this and how they connect to each other. Like Laxdæla saga is up here, and then Egil's saga is right here, and then woo! Anyway, they're all connected. That's what I took an entire graduate course called Family and Kinship in Viking and Medieval Textual Sources. Family and Kinship in Viking and Medieval Scandinavian Textual Sources. I forgot Scandinavian, but they we were just basically, the most boring parts of every saga where it's essentially the begats like in the Bible. Yeah. It's just who is related to who. That's all we read. That's a lie, but
what were we?
Professor Heslop, if you're watching, I know what we did. I'm sorry.
So I think it was in the Old Norse lit class I took. One of we read the Poetic Edda, and we were reading through the sort of the Poetic Edda part of the Volsung saga. So the chunk of the Poetic Edda that deals with the same content as the Volsung saga.
Right.
And I finally ended up making this like enormous color-coded chart of how, like, who's sleeping with who's related to who kills who, like who curses
who's sleeping with who and who's related to who is also just a circle.
It's not a healthy family.
It's not.
But it eventually like encompassed every named character and how they interacted with everybody else. And I'm really, really mad that the numerous computer changes that I've had since then, I don't have it anymore. And so one of these days I'm going to sit, I know, and I put so much time and effort into it. And
we'll make one together.
I'm going to sit down and just do a new one, and I'm going to print it out and put it in a frame or something on this wall. And people will be like, what's that? And I'll be like, look, this is the Volsung saga in graphic form.
What's that? Oh, you've made your first mistake.
Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say that's the first section of Egil's saga.
We haven't even met Egil yet.
Yeah, we haven't met Egil, but it's very important that you establish what's happening in this old portion and that we know, like, just in summary, I know we have like we hate giving chronological summaries here at Saga Saturday. If we give a chronological account of a story, you'll have to shoot us. But basically what happens is we've got a Thorolf who is great, who gets on the bad side of the king and gets killed by King Harold. And the rest of the family says, we are out of here. They make their way out to Iceland. Notably, on the way to Iceland, Kveldulf dies. He does not actually make it to Iceland, but he says, and this is a very famous segment, he says, all right, if I die from this illness, I don't usually get sick, but I'm sick right now. And he tells his crew, they're taking 2 boats. And so his son Skallagrim is on the other boat. And he's like, say hey to Skallagrim for me. Sorry, I'm dying without him. But like, if I die, put me in a wooden coffin and throw me overboard. Because, damn it, I am making it to Iceland. And wherever I end up, that's where Skallagrim should build a farm. And sure enough, he dies and they send him overboard. And this is very much like, I can't remember if it was in one of the Vinland sagas, or if it's just another part of the settlement of Iceland. But this is actually a fairly common motif of throwing over. It's usually in the pillars, the ritual pillars that are oftentimes carved figurines of gods, and you cast that overboard, and then the wood sort of just floats up onto land, and then wherever that goes, you're like, the gods want me to live here. And in this case, it's like, my dead dad is right over there, and that's where we're going to set up shop. And so he does, and Skallagrim, like, is a great farmer, they describe him as an industrious man, and he sets up a big family. He has some children with his wife, Bera, and one of whom is named Thorolf, and who is very pretty, and the other one is Egil, and we will be talking all about Egil the next week.
So before we go, two things. One, it's always interesting. So the area that they end up settling is called Borg. And it's actually, it's on the east or the western side of Iceland. You have to kind of go north from Reykjavik, and it's up there. And so there's a couple of these where they end up on the western side of Iceland. And so I'm a little bit like, if you were sailing to Iceland, yep.
So sorry, it's very small. Can you see? Yeah.
Iceland, the screen is not going to help
which section.
But yes, it's that bit right there, as you can, my hand is helpfully pointing to. So they end up settling there. But it's always interesting to me that they end up on the western side, having done this casting your stuff overboard, because you're sailing from the east. And so you would assume that the eastern half of Iceland would be settled first, but they end up, so Reykjavik is near where the initial settlement is, and that's on the western side of Iceland. Yep. And so they end up settling over there earlier, and I'm thinking it's because the land is better.
It's way better out there in the West Fields. As if you're a big Hrafnkel fan like I am, Hrafnkel lives in the east. And he's basically, I'm the biggest, baddest farmer of all of the poor people out here in the eastern farms where it's really bad to live.
So the last thing I want to say before we do our signing off is, this is the sketch that I have in the back of my copy of Egil Saga, which I just discovered like 30 seconds ago. And I just... Please enjoy. This is college-age Claire's drawing ability. I want you to note that they are sailing for some reason like perpendicular to the waves, which is dumb. Don't do that. But you've got this very fancy sail with dots in the diamonds. I don't understand what's happening. It should be striped. And these guys who are having clearly a fun time on a boat. And then I don't know this is the other boat. I don't know why all of my water was drawn that way. Like, yikes, Claire.
They look like shark fins.
Yeah, little shark fins.
Yeah.
So anyway, that is the smallest round shield on the planet. He's got a little.
That's Eldolf.
Yes,
his giant axe, his Bryntroll.
So anyway, that's gonna about wrap it up for us here. We've been going for an hour and a half, so we're back to our old form where we're like an hour.
I guess this is just what happens when I'm back. I just finished moving, just to explain for anyone who wanted to know. I've moved. And that's why I have a different background, no art on my walls. But I've moved, and that's why I've been absent, and I'm sorry I've been absent, but I'm back because Egil Saga is my favorite saga.
So thank you, everybody. Next week, we will talk about Egil's childhood and Egil's adventures. I think we're actually going to end up breaking this up into 3 just because
I think that's a good idea.
It's a longer saga. But we'll talk about Egil's adventures, and maybe once, we'll get to where Egil gets kicked out of Iceland a little bit or something. Yeah. Or when he goes to England. Yeah.
Yeah, so if you're reading along, get through Egil's murderous childhood and up to when he gets kicked out of Iceland, I think. When does that happen? Probably.
I think that's when he goes back to Norway, right? So that is... Oh, there. Hey, Egil visits Thorfinn. We should tell Thorfinn to expect visitors. I don't know. At some point.
Anyway, we'll figure it out, and we might tell you.
But until then, we are going to get out of this stream and let you guys go about your day, and we will send, if I can remember which buttons to press, you'll see our bibliography, which is currently 2 books today because that's all the reading I did. But anyway, have a great day, everybody. Have all the best, and we will talk to you later.
Bye.